The pounding on the door came before the sun had even set. Alira dropped the wooden bowl she was holding, and it cracked against the stone floor, splitting into 3 uneven pieces. She stood frozen in the middle of her small cottage, her heart slamming against her ribs, listening to the sound outside grow louder. It was not knocking. It was not human at all. It was the low, rolling growl of something large moving just beyond her door, and beneath that growl, dozens of paws pressing into the dirt. She had lived on the edge of Ashen Hollow for 18 years, and in all that time, she had never heard anything like this. The village sat at the bottom of a valley, wrapped on 3 sides by a forest so old that even the oldest men in town refused to walk past its first line of trees after dark. Alira's cottage stood closer to that tree line than any other house, not because she wanted it that way, but because no one else would have her closer to them. She was the orphan girl, the one born on the night of the last red moon, the one the midwife had refused to touch until her mother begged. She grew up hearing the whispers before she understood the words: cursed child, wolf-blooded, bad luck wrapped in skin. She had learned to live with the whispers. She had not learned to live with this. Alira moved to the window, careful to stay low, and pulled back the edge of the thin curtain just enough to see outside. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat and stay there. The sky above Ashen Hollow had turned a deep, burning red, the kind of red that came only once every several years, when the moon rose full and stained itself the color of old blood. The villagers called it the Red Moon, and they told their children to stay inside on those nights, though none of them could say exactly why anymore. The reason had been lost generations ago, buried under so many retellings, that only the fear remained, stripped of its original shape. Under that red light, standing in a wide half-circle around her cottage, were wolves. Not 2 or 3, not even 10. Alira counted quickly, her lips moving without sound, and stopped only when she reached 30, because there were no more to count. 30 wolves, their fur catching the strange light and turning the color of rust and blood, stood perfectly still, facing her door. Their eyes glowed faintly, a deep amber that seemed to hold something closer to thought than instinct. They did not snarl. They did not paw at the ground the way hunting animals did when they sensed easy prey. They simply watched, patient and silent, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. Alira let the curtain fall and pressed her back against the wall beside the window, her hands shaking. She thought of the stories her mother used to tell her before she died, stories about wolves that were not wolves at all, but she had always believed those were just old bedtime tales meant to explain away a village's fear of the forest. Now, with her heart hammering and her breath short, she was not so certain. She thought about running. The back window was small, barely wide enough for her shoulders, but she might fit through it if she had to. She thought about calling out to her nearest neighbor, old Nora, who lived just close enough that a shout might carry. But some instinct, something older than fear, told her that running would be the worst thing she could do. The wolves outside were not moving toward her door. They were simply there, holding their positions like sentries at a gate, and Alira realized with a strange, cold clarity that they were not trying to get in. They were making sure nothing else could get in either. A second sound reached her ears then, one that did not belong to any animal. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere beyond the wolves, moving toward her door with the calm confidence of someone who had never once in his life questioned whether he was welcome. Alira's mouth went dry. She backed further into the room, snatching up the iron poker from beside her small hearth, the only weapon she owned. Her hands trembled around the handle, but she held it steady in front of her, bracing herself against the table. The footsteps stopped just outside her door. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind pressed against the shutters, carrying the mineral smell of the coming night, and somewhere far off, an owl called once and fell silent, as though it too understood that this was not a night to draw attention to itself. Then came a voice, deep and even, carrying an authority that did not need to be raised to be heard. "I am not here to harm you." Alira did not answer. She could not have, even if she wanted to. Her throat had closed around every word she might have said. "I know you are frightened," the voice continued. "I would be too, if 30 wolves surrounded my home on the night of a red moon. But nothing here will touch you. Not tonight. Not while I stand at your door." Alira's grip on the poker tightened. "Who are you?" she finally managed to ask, her voice thinner than she wanted it to be. There was a pause. as though the man on the other side of the door was choosing his next words with great care. "My name is Cale," he said. "That is all I can give you tonight. The rest will have to wait until you trust me enough to open this door, and I do not expect that to happen for some time." "Then why are you here?" Alira asked, edging closer to the window again despite herself. "Because you are in danger," Cale said simply. "Far more danger than you understand. And because I made a promise a long time ago that I intend to keep." Alira wanted to laugh, though nothing about the situation was funny. A promise. As if this stranger and his 30 wolves had appeared out of the red-stained dark to fulfill some old debt owed to an orphan girl nobody in the village would even look at directly. It should have sounded absurd. Instead, it settled into her chest like something she had always known but never had words for. She peered through the gap in the curtain again, angling her eyes toward the door rather than the wolves this time, and caught her first real glimpse of the man standing there. He was tall, taller than any man she had seen pass through Ashen Hollow, with dark hair that fell just past his collar, and skin that seemed to hold the last warmth of summer, even though autumn had settled hard over the valley weeks ago. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. Even in the strange red light, she could see they were silver, a color she had never once seen on a living person. Bright and clear and startlingly calm, as if nothing in the world could unsettle him. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, not reaching for a weapon, not making any move toward the door, simply waiting. The wolves around him did not so much as shift their weight. Alira let the curtain fall shut again and pressed her hand flat against the cool stone wall, trying to steady her breathing. Every instinct she had ever trusted told her this should be the most terrifying night of her life, and in some ways it was. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, quiet and unfamiliar. For the first time she could remember, she did not feel alone in the dark. Outside, the wolves held their circle, as the last of the sunlight bled out of the sky, leaving only the deep red glow of the moon to light the clearing around her cottage. Cale did not knock again. He did not ask to be let in. He simply stood, a silent, patient shape beyond her door, as though he intended to remain there until morning, whether she spoke to him again or not. Alira lowered herself slowly onto the small wooden stool by the hearth, the poker still gripped in one hand, and stared at the door as the minutes stretched into an hour, and then longer. She thought of her mother, who had died when Alira was only 7, leaving behind nothing but a handful of vague warnings, and a locket Alira still wore beneath her dress. She thought of the years since, the cold looks from the village women, the way children were pulled away from her in the market square, the way even the priest crossed himself when she walked past the chapel. She had built her whole understanding of herself around being unwanted, unclaimed, a burden that belonged to no one. And now 30 wolves, and a stranger with silver eyes, had crossed into the heart of that same fear, and made it clear, without a single threatening word, that she was not as unclaimed as she had always believed. Near midnight, exhaustion began to pull at her, though sleep felt impossible with her home surrounded. She allowed herself to rest her head against the wall beside the window, listening to the occasional soft shift of paws against the earth outside, the low murmur of Cale's voice when he spoke once more, so quiet she almost missed it. "Sleep if you can," he said. "No harm will come to you tonight. I give you my word, and I do not give it lightly." She wanted to ask him 100 questions. Why 30 wolves? Why now, on this particular red moon, when the last one had come and gone without so much as a stray dog wandering near her door? What danger he thought she was in, and from whom, and why a man she had never met before tonight seemed to already know more about her life than she did herself. But her voice would not come, and perhaps that was for the best, because she was not certain she was ready to hear the answers. Instead, she closed her eyes, and though she did not think she would manage to rest even a moment, exhaustion eventually pulled her down into an uneasy sleep, broken by half-formed dreams of red eyes watching her from beneath dark trees, and a voice she did not recognize calling her name from somewhere far away, somewhere that felt, strangely, like home. She woke with dawn's gray light creeping through the gaps in her shutters, her neck stiff from sleeping upright against the wall. For one brief, merciful moment, she believed the entire night had been some fever dream, brought on by too little food and too much fear. Then she heard it. The low murmur outside had not gone. If anything, it had grown, as though word of what waited at her door had spread through the village overnight, drawing curious and frightened onlookers from every corner of Ashen Hollow. Illyra rose stiffly and crossed to the window, easing the curtain aside with far more caution than she had managed the night before. The wolves were still there, every single one, holding the same wide circle they had held since the moment they arrived, though the red tint had faded from the sky now that morning had come, leaving their coats a deep, ordinary shade of russet brown. And beyond them, gathered at a careful distance along the edge of the dirt path leading to her cottage, stood a crowd of villagers, wrapped in shawls and coats against the morning chill, staring at her home, with expressions ranging from horror to open fascination. At the front of that crowd stood Bram, the village elder, a stooped, thin man whose dislike of Illyra had never once softened in all the years she had known him. Beside him stood a younger man, Illyra recognized as Osric, one of the miller's sons, gripping a wood-cutting axe as though he meant to use it. Further back, half hidden behind her husband's shoulder, stood Nora, the only person in the village who had ever shown Illyra anything close to kindness, her lined face pale with worry that seemed, for once, to be directed at Illyra rather than away from her. And standing closest to the wolves, exactly where he had stood through the entire night, was Cale. In the gray morning light, Illyra could see him fully for the first time. He wore simple, dark clothing, unremarkable except for the way it seemed to move with him, as though it had been made for exactly this purpose, to allow him to stand very still, for a very long time, without complaint. His silver eyes moved once toward her window, and though she was certain the gap in the curtain was too small for him to have seen her clearly, something in his gaze told her he knew she was watching. Bram's voice cracked through the cold morning air, thin and furious. "It is her," he shouted, not to Illyra, but to the crowd around him, as though delivering a verdict he had been waiting 18 years to pronounce. "The curse has finally come to collect what it is owed. I told you all. I told you the day she was born beneath that same red sky, that no good would come of letting her live among decent people." A murmur of fearful agreement rippled through the gathered villagers. Osric raised his axe slightly, though he did not step closer, his eyes fixed nervously on the nearest wolf, a massive creature with a scar cutting across its muzzle that had not so much as blinked since dawn broke. Cale turned then, slowly, to face the crowd, and though he did not raise his voice, something in the shift of his posture made every person gathered there fall silent at once. "You will not speak of her that way again," he said, each word measured and calm, carrying none of the anger that should have accompanied such a warning, and somehow that calm made it more unsettling than any shout could have been. "Whatever you believe about this girl, whatever story you have told yourselves for 18 years to explain your own cruelty, none of it is the truth. And I would advise every one of you to remember that before you say another word in her presence." Bram's face went a mottled shade of red, though whether from anger or fear, Illyra could not tell from where she stood. "Who are you to come into our village and tell us what we may say about our own?" he demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Cale's silver eyes swept slowly over the crowd, lingering for a moment on each face as though committing them to memory. "Some call me the Alpha King," he said finally, and the words landed over the gathered villagers like a physical weight, drawing gasps from more than one throat, a title Illyra did not recognize but that clearly meant something to those who had grown up on the old stories of the forest. "You have called it a legend for so long that you forgot legends are only stories people stopped believing were true. I am telling you now that this one was never a story at all." The crowd fell into stunned silence, broken only by the shuffle of nervous feet and the soft huff of breath from 30 wolves, who had not moved once since the sun rose. Illyra remained at her window, one hand pressed flat against the cool glass, watching a man she had known for less than a day face down the entire village that had spent 18 years teaching her she was worth nothing, and do it without raising his voice even once. She did not understand what was happening to her life, or why, or what price might eventually come due for whatever protection this strange, silver-eyed king seemed determined to offer her. But for the first time since she could remember, she was not the only one standing between herself and the fear of Ashen Hollow, and something about that realization frightened her almost as much as the wolves themselves. The crowd did not disperse all at once. It thinned slowly through the morning, villagers peeling away in twos and threes, throwing uneasy glances back over their shoulders as they went, until only Bram, Osric, and a handful of the boldest men remained at the edge of the path. Cale did not move to force them away. He simply stood, patient as stone, until even Bram's fury could not sustain itself against that stillness, and the old man turned and stalked back toward the village center, muttering threats that no longer carried any real weight. By midday, only Nora remained, standing a careful distance from the nearest wolf, wringing her shawl between her hands. "Illyra," she called softly, "are you well in there?" Illyra unlatched the door for the first time since the wolves had arrived, though she kept it open only a narrow crack, one eye pressed to the gap. "I am well," she said, though her voice shook slightly on the second word. "Nora, what is happening? Do you know anything about this?" Nora's eyes flicked briefly to Cale, who stood near enough to hear every word, but made no move to interrupt. "I know only what the old women used to whisper when I was a girl," Nora said, lowering her voice, as though the wolves themselves might report her words elsewhere. "There used to be stories about a pact, made long before either of us was born, between the forest and the valley, something about a debt owed by our people to the wolves who once ruled these woods. I never believed it was more than a tale told to frighten children into staying away from the trees." Illyra's grip on the door tightened. "And now?" she asked. "Now," Nora said, glancing again at the silent ring of wolves, "I am no longer certain what to believe." Cale spoke then, his voice carrying easily across the short distance despite its quiet tone. "The pact was real," he said. "It still is, and Illyra stands at the very center of it, though she does not yet understand why." Illyra opened the door a little wider, enough to look at him directly for the first time in full daylight. "Then tell me," she said, "if I am the center of something, I deserve to know what it is." Cale held her gaze for a long moment, and something in his silver eyes softened, though his answer remained frustratingly incomplete. "Not yet," he said. "There is danger in speaking the whole truth too quickly. Danger to you and to everyone who might overhear it. But I will tell you this much. Your mother did not come to this village by accident, and neither did you." The mention of her mother struck Illyra harder than she expected, a sharp ache blooming behind her ribs. She had spent so many years with only fragments of the woman who raised her for 7 short years before illness took her, fragments that had never once included any mention of wolves, or pacts, or kings with silver eyes. "What do you know of my mother?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper now. "More than you would believe," Cale said, and for the first time since he had arrived, something like grief moved across his composed features before he mastered it again. "But that story belongs to another day. For now, you should eat and rest, and try to trust that the danger surrounding you tonight is smaller than the danger that would have found you eventually, with or without my presence at your door." Illyra wanted to press further, but exhaustion and hunger had begun to wear down even her considerable stubbornness. She retreated back into her cottage, closing the door softly rather than slamming it, and found, to her surprise, a small bundle wrapped in cloth sitting just outside her threshold, bread and dried meat, and a skin of clean water, though she had not seen anyone approach closely enough to leave it there. She looked out through the gap in the curtain, and found the wolves still holding their positions, unmoving, and Cale standing exactly where he had stood all morning, watching the tree line rather than her window now, as though something out there concerned him more than she did. She ate slowly, sitting at her small table, watching the shadows shift outside as the sun climbed higher. The wolves did not eat, did not rest, did not so much as shift their weight from one paw to another. It should have unsettled her more than it did. Instead, watching them hold their silent vigil, she found herself thinking not of fear, but of the strange, unfamiliar comfort of being guarded rather than avoided. By the time evening fell again, word of the wolves at the orphan girl's door had spread far beyond Ashen Hollow's borders. Illyra heard it in snatches of conversation carried on the wind, travelers passing along the road that skirted the village, merchants who had come for the autumn market and now lingered instead to gawk at the strange sight from a safe distance. She heard the word Alpha whispered more than once, and King, and even, from one frightened voice she did not recognize, the word prophecy. She did not understand what any of it meant, not truly, but she understood enough to know that her quiet, invisible life at the edge of the village had ended the moment 30 wolves chose her door to guard. That night, Cale did not speak much, though he remained exactly where he had stood the night before, a silent shape at the edge of her small clearing, silver eyes occasionally catching what little light remained, and glinting like distant stars. Illyra found herself watching him through the gap in her curtain far longer than she intended, studying the way he held himself, utterly still, and yet somehow radiating a kind of restrained readiness, as though he could move in an instant, if the situation demanded it, but chose stillness instead as a gift, a promise that nothing sudden or frightening would come from his direction. Near midnight, unable to sleep, she opened the door again, just enough to speak without stepping outside. "Why do the wolves not rest?" she asked. "Not even to eat, or sleep, or move at all." "They are not resting because they are not merely wolves tonight," Cale answered, turning slightly to look at her. "Every one of them chose to stand this watch. It is not a burden to them. It is an honor, older than anything this village remembers." "An honor to guard me," Illyra said, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. "I am no one. I have been no one my entire life." Cale's expression shifted then, something fierce and quiet moving behind his silver eyes. "You have been told that so many times you have mistaken it for truth," he said. "But being unclaimed by a village that never deserved you is not the same as being no one. I would ask you to remember that, even after tonight ends and the wolves return to the trees." Illyra did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing at all, simply watching him for a long moment before retreating back into the warmth of her cottage. She lay awake long after, turning his words over in her mind, feeling something shift inside her that she could not yet name, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The following days settled into an uneasy rhythm. The wolves remained at the edge of her small clearing from dusk until dawn each night, though during daylight hours they withdrew into the tree line, close enough to return in moments but far enough that the village could pretend, for a few hours at least, that ordinary life continued. Cale, however, never left. He took up a small, abandoned shepherd's hut at the edge of the forest, close enough to Illyra's cottage to reach her within moments, and though he did not intrude on her days, she often found herself glancing toward the trees, wondering if his silver eyes were watching from somewhere within the shadows. Word continued to spread. Travelers altered their routes to pass through Ashen Hollow, hoping for a glimpse of the wolves, or the man the old stories called the Alpha King. Some of the village's more desperate residents began, cautiously, to soften toward Illyra, hoping perhaps that proximity to whatever protection she now carried might extend to them as well. Others, led by Bram and a shrinking circle of the fearful and resentful, only hardened further, muttering that the wolves' arrival proved every dark thing they had ever said about her. Illyra found she cared less about their opinions with each passing day than she ever had before. For the first time in her life, someone had looked at her not as a curse to be endured or a burden to be pitied, but as something worth protecting, worth 30 wolves and a king's own vigilance. She did not yet understand why, but she found herself, despite every instinct toward caution she had built over 18 hard years, beginning to want to know. On the 6th evening after the wolves' arrival, as the sun sank low and the sky began its slow slide toward dusk, Illyra stepped outside her cottage for the first time since that first terrible night, standing on her small threshold as the wolves began emerging from the tree line to take up their positions once more. Cale watched her from a distance, something careful and hopeful in his expression, as though her stepping outside at all represented a victory he had not been certain he would see so soon. "I want the truth," Illyra said, her voice steady now, in a way it had not been 6 days earlier. "All of it. I do not care how dangerous you believe it is to speak it. I have lived 18 years not knowing who I am. I will not live one more day like that if I can help it." Cale was quiet for a long moment, the wolves settling into their circle around them both, the last light of day catching in his silver eyes and turning them, briefly, the same deep red as the moon that had first brought him to her door. Then he nodded, slowly, as though some decision that had weighed on him for days had finally been settled. "Come with me," he said. "There is somewhere I need to show you, and a story that has waited 18 years to be told correctly." Illyra followed Cale away from her cottage for the first time since the wolves had arrived, her heart beating a strange, uneven rhythm, somewhere between fear and something she could not yet name. The wolves parted to let them pass, falling into a loose formation around them as they walked, close enough to feel like protection rather than escort. The forest swallowed the last of the daylight as they moved deeper beneath its canopy, but Illyra found she was not afraid of the dark trees the way she had always been taught to be. With 30 wolves and their silver-eyed king walking beside her, The forest felt less like a place of danger, and more like a place that had simply been waiting for her to finally arrive. They walked for nearly an hour before the trees began to thin, opening into a small clearing Elira had never known existed, despite having lived her entire life within sight of this forest's edge. In the center of the clearing stood a single, ancient stone, half swallowed by moss and time, carved with symbols she did not recognize, spirals and markings that seemed to shift subtly in the fading light. "This is where the pact was made," Cale said quietly, coming to stand beside the stone. "Nearly 19 years ago, though it feels shorter to me than it should, given everything that followed." Elira reached out and touched the cold surface of the stone, tracing one of the carved spirals with a fingertip. "What pact?" she asked. Nora spoke of a debt owed by the village to the wolves. "Is that what this is?" "It is more than that," Cale said. He moved to stand across from her, the stone between them, his silver eyes catching the last violet light of dusk. "Long before your birth, there was a war in these woods, fought between our pack and another, a rival pack led by a wolf named Garrick, who believed the old ways of ruling, through fear and conquest, should replace the old ways of balance my family had kept for generations. That war nearly destroyed us. It destroyed much of the forest, and it spilled, more than once, into the villages that bordered these trees, including this one." Elira listened, hardly daring to breathe, as pieces of a history she had never known began to take shape around her. "Your mother, Dara, was among the villagers who helped my people during that war," Cale continued, his voice softening on the mention of her mother's name. "She tended our wounded when none of the healers among my own kind could be spared. She showed a kindness to my pack that few humans had ever shown before or since. When the war finally ended, badly, with Garrick's forces scattered but never fully destroyed, my father, who led our pack before me, made a vow to her. He promised that her line would be protected, always, by whatever wolves remained loyal to the old ways, in gratitude for what she had given us during the darkest days of that conflict. But that does not explain why the wolves came for me specifically," Elira said. "Why now, and not before?" Cale's expression grew heavier. "Because you are the last of her line, and because Garrick's forces have never stopped searching for a way to finish what that war began," he said. "They believe, correctly, that your blood carries something of the old pact within it, a kind of claim to lands and loyalties that Garrick has spent nearly 2 decades trying to seize for himself. As long as you lived quietly, unaware of what you carried, you were safer than you would have been otherwise. But the red moon changes things. It always has. Under its light, the old bonds grow stronger, easier to sense, easier to trace. Garrick's scouts would have found you eventually, this year or the next. I could not allow that to happen without warning, or without protection." Elira sank slowly onto a fallen log at the clearing's edge, trying to absorb everything he had told her. Her mother, kind and gentle in Elira's few clear memories, had once tended wounded wolves during a war fought in these very trees. Her own blood carried some kind of claim that a rival pack had spent years hunting, and a king with silver eyes had kept a promise made before she was even born, a promise that had cost him nothing less than moving 30 of his own people to stand guard at a stranger's door on the most dangerous night of the year. "Why did my mother never tell me any of this?" she asked quietly. "I do not know for certain," Cale admitted. "Perhaps she believed silence would keep you safer for longer. Perhaps she intended to tell you when you were older, and illness took that choice from her before she could. I wish I had an answer that brought you more comfort than that, but I do not." They sat together in the clearing as full darkness settled over the forest, the wolves keeping a respectful distance at the tree line, their amber eyes glowing faintly like scattered embers in the dark. Elira found herself, despite the weight of everything she had just learned, grateful simply to finally understand the shape of the danger surrounding her, even if she did not yet know how to face it. "What happens now?" she asked eventually. "If this Garrick is still searching for me, still wants whatever claim my blood carries, 30 wolves standing outside my door cannot guard me forever." "No," Cale agreed, "they cannot. Eventually, you will need to decide for yourself what kind of protection you want, and what kind of life you are willing to live in order to have it. But that decision does not need to be made tonight, or even this season. For now, my pack and I intend to make certain Garrick understands that this village, and everyone within it, falls under our protection, for as long as you remain here." Alira thought of Bram's furious face, of Osric's raised axe, of 18 years of whispered cruelty from people who had never once tried to understand her. And yet, she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them, you would protect even the village that has treated me so poorly. Cale's silver eyes met hers steadily. I would protect you, he said. The village benefits from that protection, only because you choose to remain within it. Should you ever choose otherwise, my loyalty travels with you, not with the people who never earned it. Something in Alira's chest loosened at those words. A tightness she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. She did not fully trust this strange, silver-eyed king yet. Not completely. Not after only 6 days. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something other than the familiar, exhausting weight of being unwanted. They walked back toward her cottage as the moon rose fully overhead, no longer red as it had been 6 nights earlier, but pale and silver, casting long shadows through the trees. The wolves moved silently around them, a living wall between Alira and whatever dangers still waited in the dark beyond the forest's edge. As they reached the edge of the clearing where her cottage stood, Alira paused, turning to face Cale fully for the first time since they had left the ancient stone behind. Thank you, she said simply, for telling me the truth, even the parts that were difficult to hear. Cale studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his silver eyes. There is more truth still to come, he said quietly. Some of it will be harder than what I shared tonight. But you deserve to know all of it, in time, and I intend to make certain you do. Alira nodded, and for a moment, standing beneath the pale silver moonlight with 30 wolves settling quietly around her cottage once more, she allowed herself to imagine, just briefly, what it might feel like to belong somewhere fully, to someone, after a lifetime of belonging to no one at all. The feeling did not last long. As she turned toward her door, a sharp, panicked shout cut through the quiet night from somewhere near the village center, followed quickly by a second voice, and then a third, rising into a confused, frightened clamor that sent every wolf in the clearing snapping instantly alert, ears pricked toward the sound. Cale's entire posture shifted in an instant, the calm, patient stillness he had held for 6 days, replaced by something sharper, more dangerous, coiled and ready. Stay close to your door, he said to Alira, his voice low and urgent now. Something is wrong. Before she could ask what, 3 of the wolves broke from the circle and vanished into the darkness, toward the village, moving faster than anything Alira had ever seen an animal move, and Cale followed a heartbeat behind them, leaving her alone at her threshold for the first time in 6 nights, her heart pounding as the shouts from the village continued to rise, sharp and afraid, into the cold night air. Alira did not stay at her threshold as Cale had asked. She told herself, as she hurried down the dark path toward the village, that she simply needed to understand what danger had arrived so suddenly, but the truth was simpler than that. After 6 days of being guarded, protected, kept safe within a small circle of wolves and one silver-eyed king, she found she could not bear the thought of standing helplessly aside while others faced whatever threat had come. By the time she reached the village square, a chaotic scene had already unfolded beneath the pale moonlight. A pack of unfamiliar wolves, their coats a dull ashen gray rather than the deep russet of Cale's pack, had gathered at the edge of the market stalls, snarling and circling a small group of terrified villagers who had been caught outside when the commotion began. Bram stood among them, his earlier fury replaced entirely by naked fear, while Osric brandished his axe uselessly at a gray wolf easily twice the size of any dog he had ever faced. Cale's wolves arrived just moments before Alira did, moving with a speed and coordination that spoke of long practice, placing themselves between the gray wolves and the frightened villagers without a single wasted movement. Cale himself strode into the center of the square, and though he still carried no weapon, something in his bearing had transformed entirely from the patient guardian Alira had come to know. He moved like a king facing down a challenge to his throne, every line of him coiled with barely restrained authority. You are far from your territory, Cale said, his voice carrying easily across the square, cold in a way Alira had not heard from him before. Garrick sent you to test how closely I am watching. You may return to him now with your answer. One of the gray wolves shifted, its form rippling strangely in the moonlight, until, in a transformation that made several villagers cry out in horror, it stood upright as a man, lean and sharp-featured, with cold yellow eyes that swept over the square with open contempt. Behind him, the other gray wolves remained as they were, watching silently. "We were only curious," the man said, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Word travels fast when the great Alpha King abandons his own lands to guard a human girl no one has ever heard of. Some of us wondered if the stories were exaggerated. They are not," Cale said simply. "Tell Garrick that if he wishes to know how closely I watch, he is welcome to come and ask me himself, rather than sending scouts to frighten villagers who have nothing to do with matters between our packs." The gray wolfman's eyes flicked briefly toward Alira, standing at the edge of the square where she had stopped, frozen, unable to look away. Something calculating moved behind his cold gaze, and Alira felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the night air. "So this is her," he said softly, more to himself than to Cale. "Interesting. I had expected someone more remarkable." Cale moved then, a single sharp step forward that carried more warning than any shout could have. "You will leave now," he said, and there was no mistaking the command in his voice this time. "Or you will discover exactly how remarkable the protection around her truly is." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then the gray wolfman smiled, a thin, humorless expression, and inclined his head slightly. "As you wish, Alpha King," he said. "Garrick will be pleased to hear how devoted you have become to your little human." He turned, his form rippling back into wolf shape as he moved, and within moments, the entire gray pack had melted back into the darkness beyond the village, leaving only silence and the frightened breathing of the villagers left behind in their wake. Bram rounded on Alira almost immediately, his fear curdling instantly back into fury, now that the immediate danger had passed. "This is because of you," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at her. 18 years we managed without wolves in our streets, without kings from the forest deciding our village belongs to them. Now look what your presence has brought down upon us. Alira's protection brought that pack to your door, not her presence," Cale said sharply, stepping between Bram and Alira before she could even find words to respond. "Without my wolves standing guard tonight, that gray pack would not have contented themselves with mere words. You would do well to remember which side of tonight's events actually kept you safe." Bram's mouth opened and closed several times, caught between fear and stubborn resentment, before he turned and stalked away without another word, several of the remaining villagers trailing uncertainly after him. Osric lingered a moment longer, his eyes moving between Cale and Alira with an expression she could not quite read, before he too retreated toward the safety of the village center. Alira remained standing in the square long after the others had gone, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her as the full weight of what had just happened settled over her. "That was Garrick's pack," she said quietly. "He knows about me now. He knows exactly where to find me." Cale turned to face her, his expression softening slightly from the hard authority he had shown moments before. "He suspected before tonight," he admitted. "My presence here, and the presence of 30 wolves at your door, was never going to remain a secret for long. But knowing where you are, and being able to reach you, are very different matters, and I intend to make certain the distance between those two things remains as wide as possible." They walked back toward her cottage together, the remaining wolves falling into formation around them once more, though Alira noticed they moved with a new tension now, ears constantly swiveling toward the darkness, noses lifted to catch any hint of scent that did not belong. "I am frightened," Alira admitted quietly as they walked, the words costing her more than she expected. "Not just of Garrick, though what I saw tonight frightens me plenty. I am frightened of what all of this means for the life I thought I understood. 6 days ago, I was simply the orphan girl no one wanted. Now I am apparently the last piece of some old pact, hunted by a rival pack, guarded by a king I barely know. I do not know how to be both those things at once." Cale was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully before he spoke. "You do not have to know yet," he said finally. 6 days is not long enough to reshape 18 years of understanding who you are, but I will tell you this. The girl no one wanted, and the woman Garrick now fears enough to send scouts against, are the same person. You were never as small or as unremarkable as this village convinced you to believe. You simply did not yet have reason to discover otherwise." Alira turned his words over in her mind as they reached her cottage once more, the wolves settling back into their familiar circle around her small clearing, though their earlier ease had not fully returned. She understood now, more clearly than she had 6 days earlier, that the danger surrounding her was not some distant, abstract thing. It had a name, and a face, and it had looked directly at her across a village square with cold, calculating eyes that promised this was only the beginning. As she finally stepped through her own door and closed it behind her, she found herself, for the first time since the wolves' arrival, not wishing for her old quiet life back. Whatever came next, whatever Garrick intended, whatever price this newfound protection might eventually demand of her, she found she preferred facing it with 30 wolves and a silver-eyed king beside her, rather than returning to the small, invisible existence she had endured for 18 empty years. She only hoped that preference would be enough to see her through whatever waited beyond the next red moon. The days that followed the confrontation in the village square brought no further sign of Garrick's grey pack, but the fear they left behind lingered over Ashen Hollow like a fog that refused to lift. Where the villagers had once regarded Alira with distant cruelty, something sharper now crept into their looks whenever she passed, a fear that had curdled into something closer to blame. She heard it in the way conversations stopped abruptly when she entered the market square, in the way mothers pulled their children closer, in the way even Nora's kind eyes now carried a shadow of worry that had not been there before. Bram wasted no time turning that fear into something more organized. On the 9th day after the wolves' arrival, Alira woke to the sound of many voices approaching her cottage, far more than the handful that had gathered that first frightened morning. She rose quickly, pulling on her shawl, and stepped to the window to find nearly 24 villagers gathered along the path, carrying torches, despite the daylight hour, their faces set with a grim determination that made her stomach twist with dread. Bram stood at the front of the crowd once more, though this time he did not shout accusations from a safe distance. He walked forward until he stood at the very edge of the wolves' circle, his chin lifted with the particular courage of a man who believed the crowd behind him made him untouchable. "We have discussed this among ourselves," he announced, his voice carrying easily to Alira's door. "Whatever protection the Forest King offers you, it has brought nothing but danger to this village. Grey wolves in our streets, strangers watching from the trees, honest people afraid to walk their own roads after dark. We will not accept this any longer. You will leave Ashen Hollow, today, and take your wolves with you." Alira's hand trembled against the doorframe as she stepped outside, forcing herself to meet Bram's gaze, rather than retreat back into the false safety of her cottage. "This is my home," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have lived here my entire life. You have no right to drive me from it." "You have brought a war to our doorstep," one of the men near the front shouted, and Alira recognized him as the blacksmith's apprentice, a man who had never once spoken a kind word to her in all the years she had passed his forge. "We have the right to protect our families from whatever danger follows you." The crowd murmured its agreement, torches lifting slightly, as though the gesture alone might convince her faster than words. Alira felt fear rising in her chest, sharp and familiar, the same fear she had lived with her entire life, only now amplified 100-fold by the sheer number of angry faces gathered before her. Then Cale stepped forward from where he had been standing near the tree line, moving to place himself directly between Alira and the crowd, and something in the simple certainty of that movement seemed to still the entire gathering at once. "No one will be driven from their home today," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel beneath its evenness. "Not by fear, and certainly not by torches carried in daylight against a girl who has done nothing but exist within a danger none of you created, and none of you have any right to punish her for." Bram's courage flickered, but he pressed forward anyway, perhaps emboldened by the crowd at his back. "And if we refuse to accept that answer," he said, "what then? Will your wolves attack us, here, in broad daylight, in front of the entire village?" Cale's silver eyes moved slowly across the gathered crowd, taking in each frightened, angry face in turn, and when he spoke again, his voice had gentled slightly, though it lost none of its authority. "My wolves will not harm a single person standing here today," he said. "Not because you deserve such mercy after choosing torches and threats over understanding, but because harming frightened, misguided people would make me no better than the very danger I have sworn to protect Alira from. However," he continued, and here his tone sharpened once more, "understand clearly that while my wolves will not attack you, they will not allow you to lay a single hand on her either. If you attempt to force her from this land against her will, you will find 30 determined obstacles between yourselves and that goal, and I promise you, none of us intend to grow tired before you do." The crowd shifted uneasily, torches lowering slightly, as the weight of his words settled over them. Osric, standing near the back, looked distinctly uncomfortable, his earlier bravado from the confrontation with the Grey Pack nowhere in evidence now. Even Bram seemed to falter slightly, though he covered it quickly with renewed bluster. "This is not finished," he said, though the certainty had drained from his voice. "We will not simply accept a stranger's word that our village is protected. What proof do we have that you can truly stand against whatever threat follows this girl?" Cale's expression grew, for the first time since Alira had known him, genuinely weary, as though the question exhausted some patience he had been carefully rationing since his arrival. "Proof," he repeated quietly. "You want proof that 30 wolves standing vigil every night since the red moon, that a confrontation with a rival pack resolved without a single villager harmed, that my own presence here for 9 days without demanding anything from any of you, none of that counts as proof enough." He shook his head slowly. "I begin to understand now why Alira's mother chose to raise her in silence rather than trust this village with the truth of who her daughter was." The mention of Alira's mother seemed to strike something in the older members of the crowd, several faces shifting with expressions Alira could not quite read, something between memory and shame. Nora, standing near the edge of the gathering, spoke up for the first time, her voice trembling but clear. "Dara was kind to every one of us," she said, looking around at her neighbors with something like disappointment. "She tended the sick even when others refused. She shared what little she had during the hard winters, and we repaid her only by whispering about her daughter for 18 years, and now by gathering with torches to drive that same daughter from her home. Have we truly become people who behave this way?" A heavy silence fell over the crowd at Nora's words, broken only by the shuffle of uneasy feet and the crackle of torches that suddenly seemed to burn with less conviction than they had moments earlier. Bram opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out, and for the first time since Alira had known him, the old elder seemed uncertain of his own righteousness. Alira, sensing an opening she had not expected, stepped forward slightly, coming to stand beside Cale rather than behind him. "I did not ask for any of this," she said, addressing the crowd directly for the first time in her life, rather than simply enduring their judgment from a distance. "I did not ask to be born on a red moon, or to carry whatever claim Garrick believes my blood holds, or to bring danger to a village that has never once made me feel welcome within it. But I am not leaving, not because I wish to endanger any of you, but because this is the only home I have ever known, and I am tired of being punished for circumstances I never chose and never controlled." The crowd remained silent, torches burning low in the morning light, and slowly, one by one, the gathered villagers began to lower their gazes, unable to hold Alira's steady, unflinching stare. Bram was the last to look away, and when he finally did, something in his posture suggested defeat rather than mere retreat. "We will speak of this again," he muttered, though the threat carried little weight now. "But for today, we will leave you in peace." The crowd dispersed slowly, torches extinguished, voices low and uncertain as they made their way back toward the village center. Nora lingered a moment longer, offering Alira a small, sad smile before she too turned to follow the others, leaving Alira and Cale alone once more, amid the settling dust of the departed crowd. "That was closer than I would have liked," Cale said quietly, once the last of the villagers had disappeared from view. "You held them back without hurting anyone," Alira said, turning to look at him with something like wonder in her expression. "Even when they threatened me directly, even with every reason to respond with force, you chose restraint instead." Cale's silver eyes met hers, something complicated moving behind them. "Force is easy," he said. "It requires no thought, no patience, only strength, and my pack has strength enough to spare. Restraint is harder, and it matters more, especially when the people threatening you are frightened rather than truly malicious. Bram and his followers are not Garrick. They are simply ordinary people who do not understand the danger surrounding them, reacting the only way fear has ever taught them to react. Punishing them for that fear would only prove every terrible thing they already believe about wolves, and about you." Alira studied him for a long moment, understanding, perhaps for the first time, the true weight of what it meant to be called a king. Not simply strength, or authority, or 30 wolves willing to stand vigil through every dangerous night. But the discipline to hold that strength in check, even when provoked, even when it would have been easier, in every immediate sense, to simply let it loose. "Thank you," she said softly, "for choosing patience with them, even when they did not deserve it." Cale's expression softened into something that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it faded quickly beneath the weight of everything still unresolved between them. "I did not choose patience for their sake," he admitted. "I chose it because I did not want you to watch me become the very monster this village has always feared, not when I am trying so hard to prove to you that I am not one." Alira did not have an answer for that, but something warm settled in her chest regardless, a fragile, tentative trust beginning to take root where only fear had grown before. As the sun climbed higher over Ashen Hollow, casting long shadows across the clearing, where 30 wolves still stood their patient watch, she found herself, for the first time since this strange, impossible story had begun, daring to imagine a future in which she was not simply surviving, but truly, finally, beginning to belong. 2 weeks after the wolves first arrived at her door, Alira found herself restless in a way she could not quite explain. The village had settled into an uneasy peace since the confrontation with Bram's crowd, and though whispers still followed her through the market square, no one had dared gather with torches again. Cale's pack maintained their nightly vigil without fail, and Garrick's gray wolves had not returned, though Cale warned her more than once that their absence likely meant planning rather than retreat. It was during one of these quiet, uncertain evenings that Alira decided, for reasons she could not fully articulate even to herself, to finally clean the small storage space beneath her cottage floor, a task she had avoided for years, out of some instinctive reluctance she had never questioned closely. She pried up the loose floorboard near her hearth, the one her mother had always warned her, gently but firmly, never to disturb without good reason, and found beneath it a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth with age, sealed with a simple iron latch that gave way easily beneath her fingers. Inside, wrapped carefully in a square of faded cloth, lay a journal, its leather cover water-damaged and soft with age, the pages within filled with handwriting. Alira recognized instantly despite not having seen it in 11 years. Her mother's hand, careful and looping, exactly as Alira remembered from the few letters Dara had left behind. Her fingers trembled as she opened the journal to its first page, and she read late into the night, by the light of a single candle, the wolves outside her window forgotten entirely, as her mother's words drew her into a past she had never known existed. The early entries spoke of ordinary things, small village concerns, the weather, a difficult harvest, worries about a cough that would not fully clear through one particularly hard winter. But as Alira turned the pages, the entries began to shift, growing more careful, more guarded, as though her mother had grown increasingly aware that these words might one day be read by eyes other than her own. "There is a war in the forest," one entry read, dated some months before Alira's birth. "The wolves who live there, the ones the old stories speak of, are not merely animals as the village believes. I have seen this with my own eyes now, more than once, tending wounds that should not have been possible for any ordinary creature to survive. I do not know what I have stumbled into, but I find I cannot simply turn away from it, not when so many suffer and so few are willing to help." Later entries grew warmer, more personal, speaking of a wolf king with silver eyes, who had begun visiting her cottage not for healing, but simply for conversation, for the quiet company of someone who did not fear him or seek anything from him beyond friendship freely given. "Cale came again tonight," one entry read, and Alira's breath caught at the familiar name written in her mother's careful hand. "He does not speak of the war unless I ask, though I can see it weighs on him more heavily than he allows himself to show. I find myself looking forward to his visits more than I probably should, given everything else uncertain in my life just now. There is something in him that reminds me it is possible to carry great burdens without losing gentleness in the process." Alira read on, her heart pounding, through entries that spoke of growing closeness between her mother and a king Alira had only known for 2 weeks, though the journal suggested a friendship, and perhaps something deeper, that had spanned considerably longer. She read of the pact made at the ancient stone, of promises exchanged, of a war finally ending though never fully resolved, and finally, near the journal's last pages, of her mother's own pregnancy, discovered with what the careful handwriting suggested was equal parts joy and fear. I do not know what this child will carry within her, one of the final entries read, dated only months before Alira's birth. Cale believes she will carry some measure of the old bond between our peoples, though even he cannot say for certain what that will mean, once she is born beneath whatever moon chooses to mark her arrival. I only hope that whatever she carries brings her more joy than burden, and that if the day ever comes, when she must learn the truth of her own beginning, she will have someone beside her who can explain it with more grace than mere words on a page ever could. The journal ended there, the remaining pages left blank, and Alira sat in the flickering candlelight for a long time, after finishing the final entry, her mind reeling with questions that no amount of rereading could answer. She did not wait for morning. She rose immediately, wrapped the journal carefully in its cloth, and stepped outside into the cool night air, finding Cale exactly where he always stood, near the edge of the clearing, his silver eyes turning toward her the moment she emerged. "You knew my mother," she said, holding the journal up so he could see it clearly in the moonlight. "Not merely as someone who tended your wounded during the war. You knew her closely. You cared for her." Cale's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession, surprise giving way to something gentler, more resigned, as though he had known this moment would eventually arrive, and had simply hoped for more time before it did. "Yes," he said simply. "I cared for her a great deal." "Then why did you not tell me this from the very beginning?" Alira demanded, her voice caught between hurt and confusion. "Why let me learn it from a journal hidden beneath my own floor, rather than from your own words?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, choosing his answer with obvious care. "Because the truth of what your mother and I shared is complicated," he said finally, "and I did not want you to hear it in pieces, filtered through my own grief, before you had time to understand everything else surrounding your birth first. Your mother was remarkable, Alira, kind in ways this village never deserved, brave in ways few humans I have known have ever managed. What grew between us was never planned, never simple, and it ended far too soon, taken by an illness neither my knowledge nor my packed strength could touch." "You loved her," Alira said quietly, "and it was not a question." "I did," Cale admitted, his silver eyes carrying a depth of old grief that Alira had not seen in him before this moment. "And when she died, I made a promise to myself, beyond even the pact my father had made, that her daughter would never face the world as unprotected as this village made you feel for 18 years. I have been waiting, watching from a distance, for the right moment, to fulfill that promise properly. The red moon simply forced my hand sooner than I had planned." Alira sank onto the small bench outside her door, the journal still clutched in her hands, trying to reconcile the mother she remembered, gentle and quiet, and entirely ordinary in Alira's childhood memories, with the woman revealed in these careful, guarded pages, a woman who had loved a king from the forest, and carried a secret large enough to shape her daughter's entire fate. "Am I your daughter?" she asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could fully consider whether she wanted the answer. Cale's eyes widened slightly, something like understanding, and perhaps a hint of sorrow, moving across his features. "No," he said gently. "Your father was a man from a neighboring village, someone your mother cared for deeply, before I ever came into her life, and who died before you were born. Whatever bond you carry within your blood comes through your mother's connection to the old pact, not through any connection to me directly. I am sorry if my closeness to her led you to hope otherwise, or to fear it, whichever the case may have been." Alira felt something complicated settle in her chest at that answer, relief and disappointment tangled together in ways she did not fully understand. "I do not know what I hoped for," she admitted honestly. "Only that I am tired of learning the truth of my own life in fragments, from journals and half-finished explanations. I want to understand fully, Cale, all of it, not simply because I deserve to know, though I believe I do, but because I cannot decide what kind of life I want to build from all of this, until I understand exactly what I am building it from." Cale studied her for a long moment, something resolute settling into his expression, as though her words had finally convinced him of something he had been reluctant to fully accept until now. "Then I will tell you everything," he said. "Not tonight, perhaps, for it is a longer story than even this night has hours remaining to hold. But soon, and completely, I promise you that. You have earned far more honesty than this village, or even I, have offered you so far." Alira nodded, exhaustion finally beginning to catch up with the emotional weight of the evening, and rose to return to her cottage, the journal held carefully against her chest. As she reached her door, she paused, turning back to look at him one final time. "Thank you," she said, "for loving her. Even knowing how that story ended, I am glad she had someone who saw her clearly, the way this village never did." Kale's expression softened into something achingly gentle, and for a moment, Illyra thought she saw, beneath the composed authority of a king who had stood guard through 15 nights without complaint, simply a man who still carried grief for a woman he had lost too soon, and hope, tentative but real, for the daughter she had left behind. "Rest now," he said softly. "Tomorrow, we begin the rest of the truth." Illyra retreated into her cottage, the journal safely beside her, as she finally allowed sleep to claim her. Her dreams that night filled not with fear, but with fragments of a story, finally beginning to make sense. A story that had started long before her birth, and was only now, at last, becoming fully her own. Kale kept his promise the following evening, arriving at Illyra's door as the sun began its slow descent, though this time he did not ask her to walk with him into the forest. Instead, he asked permission to enter her home, a small gesture that struck Illyra as significant, given how carefully he had maintained distance between himself and her threshold for the past 15 nights. She opened the door fully and stepped aside, watching as he crossed into her small cottage for the first time, his presence somehow filling the modest space without overwhelming it. He settled into the chair across from her small table, and Illyra took her own seat, the journal resting between them like a silent witness to whatever conversation was about to unfold. "I told you last night that the truth was more complicated than a single conversation could hold," Kale began, his silver eyes steady on hers. "That remains true, but I will give you as complete a picture as I can tonight, and answer whatever questions remain once I have finished." Illyra nodded, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling with anticipation. "The pact my father made with your mother was not simply a promise of gratitude," Kale said. "It was a binding of blood and loyalty, the kind our people rarely extend beyond our own kind. When your mother tended our wounded during the war against Garrick, she did something few humans in generations had done. She saw us not as monsters to be feared or tools to be used, but as people deserving of the same care she would have given anyone else. My father recognized that kindness as something rare enough to protect permanently, and so the pact was formed, not merely as thanks, but as a promise that her bloodline would forever hold a place of honor and protection among our pack." "But why would that promise extend to me so completely?" Illyra asked. "I never did anything to earn such loyalty. I did not even know it existed until 3 weeks ago. Loyalty given through pact does not require the recipient to earn it repeatedly," Kale explained. "It was earned once, fully, by your mother, and it passes now to you simply because you are her daughter, her only child, the sole remaining piece of the bond she forged with my family. That is not a burden you need feel guilty for carrying, Illyra. It is simply the shape your inheritance took, whether either of us would have chosen it that way or not." Illyra absorbed this, turning it over slowly in her mind. "And Garrick?" she asked. "Why does he want something that was never his to claim?" Kale's expression darkened slightly at the mention of his rival's name. "Garrick has never accepted my family's approach to leadership," he said. "Where my father, and now I, believe strength should serve balance and protection, Garrick has always believed strength exists to be seized and wielded without restraint. The pact my father made with your mother represents everything Garrick despises about our rule, an alliance built on gratitude and mutual respect, rather than conquest. He believes that if he can claim what the pact protects, meaning you, and the old bonds you carry within your blood, he can prove that the entire foundation of balance my family has maintained for generations is nothing more than weakness, dressed up as honor." "What exactly do I carry?" Illyra asked. "You keep speaking of bonds within my blood, but I do not understand what that truly means." Kale considered his answer carefully before speaking. "The old pact was sealed not merely with words, but with a binding that runs through blood, passed from your mother to you at your birth," he said. "It grants you a kind of claim, recognized by every pack that still honors the old ways, to call upon protection from packs bound by similar packs across the wider forest, not merely mine. It also grants, though this part is more complicated, a measure of authority that Garrick could use, if he claimed it through conquest rather than honor, to unify packs that currently remain independent of both his rule and mine. Illyra's breath caught. You mean if he captured me, he could use whatever I carry to gain control over other packs entirely? Not merely gain control, Cale said grimly. He could claim a legitimacy that generations of conquest alone have never managed to give him. That is why he has hunted your bloodline so relentlessly, and why the danger surrounding you is far greater than simple cruelty or ambition. It is a danger that could reshape the balance of the entire forest, for better or far worse, depending on who ultimately holds the claim your blood carries. The weight of this new understanding settled heavily over Illyra, far beyond anything she had imagined when the wolves first arrived at her door 3 weeks earlier. She had believed herself simply an unwanted orphan, caught up in some old debt owed by strangers. Now she understood. She stood at the center of something that could alter the fate of an entire forest, and everyone living within it. I do not know how to carry something this large, she admitted quietly, her voice smaller than she intended. Cale reached across the small table, his hand hovering near hers without quite touching, as though he wanted to offer comfort, but remained uncertain whether she would welcome it. You do not have to carry it alone, he said. That is precisely what the 30 wolves at your door represent, Illyra. Not merely guards fulfilling an old obligation, but a pack that has chosen, every single one of them, to stand beside you through whatever comes next. You do not need to understand everything at once, or decide your entire future in a single evening. You simply need to know that you are not facing any of this without support, not any longer. Illyra allowed herself, finally, to reach out and let her hand rest against his, a small gesture that nonetheless felt significant, after 3 weeks of careful distance between them. What must I do? She asked. If Garrick continues to hunt what I carry, if this danger only grows larger the longer I remain unclaimed by any side, what choice do I actually have? Cale's fingers curled gently around hers, and for a moment, something passed between them that went beyond mere alliance or obligation, something that made Illyra's heart quicken, despite the gravity of their conversation. You have several paths before you, he said carefully. You could choose to formally claim the pact your mother began, binding yourself fully to my pact's protection and authority, which would grant you considerable safety, but would also mean accepting a life quite different from the one you have known. You could attempt to remain neutral, unclaimed by any pack, though I fear that path offers far less safety than it might appear, given how determined Garrick has already proven himself to be. Or, he continued, his voice softening further, you could choose something else entirely, a path we have not yet had reason to discuss, though I suspect you may already sense what I mean. Illyra met his silver eyes, understanding the unspoken possibility hovering between them, though neither of them gave it words in that moment. What would you choose? She asked quietly, if the decision were yours alone to make. I would choose to protect you regardless of what you decide, Cale said honestly. But if you are asking what I hope for, beyond mere obligation, or old promises made before either of us understood what they would eventually mean, then I hope you will choose to remain close enough that I do not have to imagine a future where you face any part of this alone. The words hung between them, heavier with meaning than either of them seemed fully ready to address directly, and Illyra found herself, despite 3 weeks of fear and confusion and grief, for a life she had never known she was missing, feeling something warm and hopeful bloom quietly in her chest. I need time, she said finally, gently withdrawing her hand, though not unkindly. Not to doubt you, or the pack, or even the possibility you are suggesting. Simply time to understand who I am becoming, before I decide who I want to become it alongside. Cale nodded, respect clear in his expression despite whatever disappointment he might have felt at her careful hesitation. That is more than fair, he said. Take whatever time you need. I have waited this long to fulfill the promise I made to your mother. I can wait a while longer for you to find your own answers, whatever they turn out to be. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, as full darkness settled over Ashen Hollow, the wolves outside beginning their familiar nightly vigil, and Illyra found herself, for the first time since this entire impossible story began, feeling less like a girl caught helplessly in events beyond her control, and more like someone finally beginning to understand the shape of her own power, however uncertain and unfamiliar that power still felt. But even as that quiet, hopeful moment stretched between them, a distant howl rose from somewhere deep within the forest, low and mournful, followed quickly by a second, and then a third, carrying a warning that neither Alira nor Cale could mistake for anything but what it truly was. Cale rose immediately, his expression shifting back into the sharp, coiled readiness she had seen only once before, on the night Garrick's scouts first tested the village's defenses. "They are closer than I expected," he said grimly, moving toward the door. "Stay inside, Alira, and bar it as soon as I leave. Whatever time we hoped to have before this moment arrived, I fear it has just run out far sooner than either of us anticipated." Alira did not stay inside as instructed, not fully. She barred the door as Cale asked, but she remained pressed close to the window, watching through the gap in her curtain as chaos began to unfold at the edge of the clearing. The howls grew closer with each passing moment, joined now by the sound of many paws moving swiftly through the underbrush, and Cale's wolves, who had stood so patiently still for 3 weeks, exploded into motion, fanning out to meet whatever was approaching from the tree line. The gray wolves emerged from the darkness like a tide, far more of them than had come to test the village weeks earlier, their numbers spilling out from between the trees until Alira lost count somewhere past 40. At their head strode a massive wolf, larger than any other in the clearing, his coat a deep, ashen gray shot through with streaks of black, his eyes burning a cold, hard yellow that Alira recognized instantly as belonging to the same cruel intelligence she had glimpsed in the scout who confronted them in the village square. Garrick had come himself. Cale strode forward to meet him, transforming as he moved with a fluid grace that Alira had never witnessed before, his human form rippling into something else entirely, a wolf, larger even than Garrick, his fur a deep russet red that seemed to catch what little moonlight filtered through the clouds and hold it like an ember. The sight should have terrified her. Instead, watching him move to place himself between his pack and the invading gray wolves, Alira felt something closer to fierce, protective pride swell in her chest. The two massive wolves circled each other for a long, tense moment, neither making the first move, and Alira understood, watching them, that this was not merely an animal confrontation, but something closer to a negotiation, carried out through posture and presence, rather than words. Then Garrick lunged, and the clearing erupted into motion. Alira pressed herself against the wall beside her window, watching in horrified fascination as the two packs met in the open ground before her cottage. She had expected savagery, mindless violence born of ancient animal instinct, but what she witnessed instead was something closer to a disciplined battle. Cale's wolves moving in coordinated pairs and trios, protecting weaker members while pressing advantages against isolated gray wolves, never once losing the shape of their formation, even as the fighting grew fierce around them. Cale himself fought at the center of it all, meeting Garrick's repeated assaults with a strength and precision that spoke of years, perhaps centuries, of experience, driving his rival back time and again, without ever allowing the larger wolf to break through toward the cottage where Alira sheltered. Every time Garrick attempted to circle wide, seeking a path around the defending pack toward her door, one of Cale's wolves intercepted him, forcing him back into the center of the clearing where Cale waited. The fighting stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though Alira knew later it could not have lasted more than a quarter hour. She watched wolves fall and rise again, watched blood dark against silver fur in the moonlight, watched Cale take a vicious strike along his flank that made her cry out despite herself, though he barely seemed to notice the wound, turning his fury instead into a renewed assault that finally, drove Garrick backward toward the tree line. It was in that moment, watching Cale press his advantage despite his own injury, that Alira understood with sudden, overwhelming clarity exactly what she was witnessing. This was not a monster fighting for territory or conquest. This was a king, defending his people, defending her, at real cost to himself, choosing again and again to place his own body between danger and the people he had sworn to protect. Garrick, seeing his forces faltering and his own path forward blocked at every turn, finally let out a sharp, furious howl and began to retreat, his remaining wolves peeling away from the fight to follow him back into the darkness of the forest. Cale did not pursue, though every line of his massive frame suggested he wanted to, choosing instead to hold his ground at the center of the clearing, watching until the last of the gray wolves had vanished from sight. Only then did he transform back, dropping to one knee, in the sudden weakness that followed, his hand pressed against the wound along his side, where dark blood had begun soaking through his torn clothing. Illyra threw open her door before she had fully decided to move, rushing across the clearing without any thought for her own safety, dropping to her knees beside him amid the wolves who had begun gathering close. Several of them wounded themselves, though none as severely as Cale appeared to be. "You are hurt," she said, her hands hovering uncertainly over the wound, uncertain how to help, but unwilling to simply watch. "It looks worse than it is," Cale said, though the strain in his voice suggested otherwise. "Garrick has always fought dirty when he cannot win cleanly." Illyra tore a strip from her own shawl without hesitation, pressing it firmly against the wound despite his weak protest that she should not concern herself with his injuries. "You just fought an entire pack to keep them away from my door," she said fiercely. "You will let me help you now, and I will hear no further argument about it." Something in her tone, perhaps the fierce determination behind it, made Cale's protests fade entirely, and he allowed her to tend the wound as best she could there in the clearing, several of his wolves gathering close around them both, forming a protective circle that felt, in that moment, less like duty and more like genuine care. "Why did you fight him yourself?" Illyra asked quietly, as she worked. "You could have let your pack handle the confrontation while you stayed safer at the edges." Cale's silver eyes met hers, weary but steady despite his pain. "Because Garrick came for you tonight, not merely to test our defenses, but because he understood, somehow, that our conversation earlier had moved us closer to a bond he desperately wants to prevent," he said. "A threat of that magnitude required more than my pack's strength alone. It required that he understand exactly how far I am willing to go to keep you safe." Illyra's hands stilled against the makeshift bandage, her heart aching at the raw honesty in his answer. "And how far is that?" she asked softly. "As far as it takes," Cale said simply, no hesitation in his answer at all. "Every time, without exception, for as long as you will allow me to stand beside you." Illyra finished securing the bandage, her hands trembling slightly, though not from fear any longer. She looked around at the clearing, at the wolves who bore their own wounds without complaint, who had fought and bled to protect a girl the village had once discarded, and she understood, finally and completely, that whatever fear she had carried about this pack, about what it meant to be claimed by something as old and powerful as this old pact, had been misplaced from the very beginning. These were not monsters the village should fear. They were protectors who had chosen, every single one of them, to place themselves between her and a danger she had not even fully understood until tonight. "We should get you inside," she said, helping him rise despite his obvious pain. "You need proper rest, and I intend to make certain you get it, whether you believe you require it or not." Cale allowed her to help him toward her cottage, leaning more heavily on her shoulder than his pride likely wanted to admit, and as they crossed the threshold together for the first time since he had entered her home the previous evening, Illyra felt something settle within her, quiet and certain, a decision forming that she had not fully realized she was ready to make until this very moment. Whatever came next, whatever Garrick still intended, whatever price this bond might eventually demand of her, she no longer doubted which side of this old, complicated war she wanted to stand on. She wanted to stand beside the king who had bled to protect her, and the pack who had chosen her as their own, for as long as they would have her. The days following Garrick's attack passed in a haze of careful healing and quiet reflection. Cale's wound, though serious, began to close within days rather than weeks, a testament to whatever strength ran through him that Illyra still did not fully understand, though she found herself grateful for it regardless of the mystery behind it. She spent those days at his side more often than not, tending what remained of his injury, listening as he spoke, gradually, and without her needing to ask, of his own past, his father's leadership before him, the weight of responsibility he had carried, since taking up the mantle of Alpha King, far younger than he had ever expected to. The village, too, began to shift in the aftermath of that night. Word of the battle spread quickly, and though some, Bram chief among them, remained stubbornly resentful, others began to look at Illyra differently, with something closer to gratitude than fear. Nora visited often during those days, bringing food and quiet company, and even Osric appeared at her door once, awkward and uncertain, offering a mumbled apology for his earlier hostility that Illyra accepted with more grace than she might have managed a month earlier. It was on the 7th day after the attack, as autumn began its final slide toward winter, and the air outside carried the first sharp bite of frost, that Illyra found Cale sitting alone at the edge of the clearing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and violet, his wound, healed enough now that he no longer favored his side when he moved. "I have made a decision," she said, settling onto the ground beside him without preamble. Cale turned to look at her, something careful and hopeful moving behind his silver eyes. "And what decision is that?" he asked. "I want to claim the pact fully," Illyra said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was proposing. "Not because Garrick forces my hand, though I understand the danger he represents makes this choice more urgent than it might otherwise have been. I want to claim it because I have spent 3 weeks watching your pack bleed and stand vigil for a girl they had never even met before the red moon brought them to my door. And I understand now that this is not merely protection being offered to me. It is a family, offering me a place within it, and I find I want that place more than I have ever wanted anything in my entire life." Cale was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her heart quicken despite her nerves. "This is not a decision to make lightly," he said finally, though his voice carried more warmth than caution. "Claiming the pact fully means binding yourself not merely to my protection, but to the full weight of everything that comes with it, the responsibilities, the dangers that will not fully disappear, even with Garrick eventually dealt with, the life among my pack that will look very different from anything this village ever offered you." "I understand that," Illyra said, "and I choose it anyway, with clear eyes and full understanding, not because I am afraid of facing the alternative alone, but because I have found something here, with you and your pack, that I never once believed I would find anywhere in my entire life. I do not wish to walk away from that simply because the path forward feels uncertain." Something in Cale's expression shifted then, the careful composure he had maintained since the very first night finally giving way to something rawer, more honest. He reached out, gently, and took her hand in both of his silver eyes searching hers, as though seeking confirmation that she truly understood the magnitude of what she was offering. "If you claim this pact," he said quietly, "you claim more than protection, Illyra. You claim a bond that, once formed, does not easily unmake itself. I have tried, these past 3 weeks, to give you space to decide this for yourself, without pressure from my own feelings weighing too heavily on your choice. But I will not pretend any longer that what I feel for you has remained simple obligation, born from a promise made to your mother. It has grown into something far more personal than that, and I would understand if that knowledge changes how you wish to proceed." Illyra's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice, so different from the composed authority he had shown the village, from the fierce protector who had bled defending his pack. This, she understood, was simply Cale, uncertain and hopeful in equal measure, offering her not merely a king's protection, but a man's honest heart. "It does not change my answer," she said softly, tightening her grip on his hands. "If anything, it makes my answer easier to give. I do not wish to claim this pact merely as protection, Cale. I wish to claim it because somewhere across these past 3 weeks, watching you stand at my door through every dangerous night, watching you choose restraint over cruelty even when provoked, watching you bleed to keep your pack in this village safe, I found myself falling for the man behind the king's title, not merely accepting the safety he offered." Cale's breath caught audibly, something bright and unguarded breaking across his features that Illyra had not seen from him before, not even in the quiet moments they had shared over the past week. He lifted her hand gently to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles that made warmth bloom through her entire body. "Then let us begin the binding properly," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "Though I warn you now, the ceremony itself is old and formal, and it will require the presence of the full pack, and likely the ancient stone where my father first made his promise to your mother." "I would not want it any other way," Illyra said, and meant it completely. The binding ceremony took place 3 days later, beneath the ancient stone deep within the forest. The entire pack gathered in a wide circle around them both, as the last light of day gave way to evening. Illyra stood before the stone in a simple dress Nora had helped her prepare, her heart pounding with nerves and anticipation in equal measure, watching as Cale approached in his human form, dressed formally for the first time since she had known him, his silver eyes bright with an emotion that needed no words to convey. The ceremony itself was simpler than Alira had expected, built around old words spoken in a language she did not fully understand, though their meaning became clear enough through the actions that accompanied them. A shared cut along each of their palms, blood mingled together and pressed against the ancient stone, sealing a bond that Cale explained afterward could not be easily broken by anything short of death itself. As the final words of the ceremony faded into the evening air, Alira felt something shift within her, subtle but unmistakable, a warmth spreading through her blood that felt, strangely, like coming home, to a place she had never actually visited before. The wolves gathered around them began to howl, one after another, a chorus of sound that rose into the darkening sky, celebratory rather than mournful, welcoming her formally into a family she had never expected to find. "It is done," Cale said softly, drawing her close against him, as the howling continued around them. "You are bound now, fully, to this pack, and to me, for as long as either of us draws breath." Alira leaned into his embrace, watching the wolves around them, watching the stars beginning to emerge overhead, feeling more certain of her place in the world than she had ever felt in 18 long years of believing herself unwanted and unclaimed. "I am ready," she said, meaning it with every part of herself. "Whatever comes next, whatever Garrick still intends, I am ready to face it. Not as the orphan girl the village once discarded, but as whoever I am meant to become now, standing beside you." Cale pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, his arms tightening protectively around her. "Then let him come," he said, quiet certainty carrying through every word. "Whatever Garrick still hopes to claim, he will find it far better protected now than he ever imagined possible." Above them, the stars wheeled slowly across the darkening sky, and somewhere deep within the forest, the pack's celebration continued long into the night, marking not merely a binding completed, but a beginning, uncertain and full of danger still to come, but no longer faced alone. The months that followed the binding brought changes to Alira's life, so profound that she sometimes found herself pausing in quiet moments, simply to marvel at how completely her world had transformed. She learned the ways of the pack, slowly, patiently, guided by Cale, and by the wolves, who had once stood silent vigil at her door, and now called her friend, sister, and eventually, as her understanding grew, something closer to their queen. She learned to sense the bond running through her blood, faint at first but growing steadily clearer, a quiet awareness of the pack's presence that felt, more than anything, like never truly being alone again. Garrick did not simply disappear after his defeat at the clearing. Reports reached them throughout the winter of gray wolves, testing the boundaries of allied territories, probing for weaknesses, gathering whatever remaining strength he could muster after the losses he suffered that night. Cale grew more watchful as the months passed, and Alira grew stronger alongside him, training with the pack, learning to sense danger before it fully announced itself, preparing herself for a confrontation both of them understood was still to come. The village, too, continued its slow transformation. Bram's influence faded steadily as more villagers witnessed, month after month, the genuine safety and prosperity that Cale's pack brought to Ashen Hollow, rather than the danger he had always predicted. By midwinter, even Bram had grudgingly ceased his open hostility, though he never fully warmed to Alira the way others eventually did. Nora became a frequent visitor to the small home Alira and Cale built together at the edge of the forest, and slowly, carefully, the girl who had once been the village's most unwanted resident found herself, for the first time in her life, genuinely welcomed by the people among whom she had grown up. The confrontation both Alira and Cale had been anticipating finally arrived, fittingly, on the night of the next red moon, exactly 1 year after 30 wolves had first gathered outside her cottage door. Garrick came with a force larger than his previous attempt, having spent the intervening months rebuilding his strength and, Cale suspected, forming alliances with other discontented packs, scattered throughout the wider forest, who resented the balance his family had maintained for so many generations. But this time, Alira did not shelter helplessly behind her door, watching through a gap in the curtain as others fought to protect her. She stood instead at Cale's side as the gray wolves emerged from the tree line under the deep red glow of the rising moon, her own connection to the pact fully awakened now after a year of training and understanding, lending her a strength and clarity she had never possessed, as the frightened orphan girl who first witnessed wolves gathering at her door. Garrick himself stepped forward, his massive gray form unmistakable even beneath the crimson light, his yellow eyes fixed on Alira, with an intensity that carried a full year of frustrated ambition behind it. "You have grown bold, human," he said, his voice carrying the same cold mockery she remembered from his scout's earlier taunts. "Bold enough to stand openly against me now, rather than hiding behind the Alpha King's protection." "I am not merely hiding behind anyone's protection any longer," Alira said, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that her voice did not tremble at all. "I am the pact you have spent years hunting, Garrick, fully claimed and fully awakened. Whatever legitimacy you believed capturing me would grant you no longer exists to be taken. I have already chosen my side, freely and completely, and no amount of force on your part will unmake that choice now." Garrick's expression twisted with fury at her words, and he lunged forward, not toward Cale this time, but directly toward Alira herself, perhaps believing that removing her from the equation entirely might still salvage whatever plan he had built his hopes upon. But Alira did not flinch, and she did not need Cale to intervene on her behalf this time. The bond within her blood, awakened fully now through a year of careful training, rose to meet the threat, and though she remained fully human in form, unable to transform as the wolves around her could, something in her connection to the ancient pact allowed her to hold her ground, meeting Garrick's charge with a strength that stopped him short, as though he had struck an invisible wall built from the accumulated loyalty of every wolf who had ever sworn themselves to her family's protection. Garrick staggered back, stunned, and in that moment of hesitation, Cale moved, closing the distance between himself and his old rival, with the fierce, focused speed of a king who had waited a full year for exactly this opportunity. The battle that followed was shorter than the first confrontation had been. Garrick's forces already weakened by months of failed alliances and internal discord, no match for a pack that had spent the same months growing stronger under the combined leadership of their Alpha King, and the Queen who now stood fully awakened at his side. When it ended, Garrick himself lay defeated at the clearing's edge, his remaining forces scattered and fleeing into the surrounding darkness, and Cale stood over his old rival, silver eyes hard with the finality of a conflict that had shadowed his entire reign, since long before Alira had ever known his name. "This ends tonight," Cale said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "You will trouble this pact, and this queen, no further." Garrick, defeated and diminished, offered no further defiance, and as dawn broke over the clearing, he, and what remained of his shattered forces, withdrew fully from the territory, never to return with hostile intent again. Alira watched him go, standing beside Cale as the deep red of the red moon finally faded into the pale gold light of morning, and felt, for the first time since this entire remarkable story began exactly 1 year earlier, a sense of complete and settled peace. The village celebrated in the days that followed, word of Garrick's defeat spreading quickly through Ashen Hollow and beyond, and even those who had once feared the wolves at Alira's door now gathered to honor the Queen who had helped secure their safety so completely. Nora wept with joy when she heard the news, and even Bram, in his own grudging way, admitted that perhaps he had been wrong to fear what he never fully understood. That evening, as the pack gathered once more, beneath the ancient stone, deep within the forest, this time in celebration rather than solemn ceremony, Alira stood at Cale's side, watching 30 wolves, and many more beyond them now, howl their joy into the star-filled sky. "1 year ago," she said quietly, turning to look at Cale, "I was simply the orphan girl no one wanted, hiding behind a locked door while 30 strangers surrounded my home under a moon the color of blood. And now?" Cale asked, though his silver eyes suggested he already knew exactly what she would say. "Now I am exactly who I was always meant to become," Alira said, a smile breaking across her face as she looked out over the pack that had become her family, the king who had become her heart, and the life she had built from fragments of an old promise made long before she was born. "I am no longer the girl the world discarded. I am the queen this pack, and this forest, and even this village, was always waiting for." Cale drew her close, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips as the pack's celebration continued around them, and above them both, the sky finally cleared fully of the last lingering red of the fading moon, leaving only clear, bright stars scattered across the endless dark, marking the beginning of a future neither of them intended to face ever again, without the other standing steadfastly by their side.